It was a great party on a common area shared by the homes. The food was prepared and brought by wives and one or two husbands who had at least one specialty dish. A specialty dish usually meant it was the only thing they knew how to cook. The booze poured in rivers consisting of bottles of store beer, wines, and spirits, as well as some very good home-brewed beer and house wine from a nice and cheerful retired gay couple who lived on the street corner. Steve Bollinger got along great with them. This was not surprising, as Steve got along well with almost everyone he knew. Steve was 45 years old, quite handsome, and more than successful enough in his professional life as a business consultant and in his home life. Sandra, his wife, was 42 and seemed even more attractive to him now than she had when they met in their 20s. She worked part-time illustrating books, using a studio in their home. Life as Steve knew it was good and probably, he thought somewhat smugly, couldn't have been better. Their 20-year marriage had brought them to a fairly affluent suburb, and their neighbors were all similar to one another to one degree or another, with a few honorable exceptions. The older gay couple were retired university administrators. There were a few senior mid-level police officers, a few lawyers, one or two management consultants like Steve, and a few other retirees. Steve and Sandra's twins were each 18 years old, born 2 years after their marriage. While they were still dating, they decided that 2 children was the perfect number. So when the twins were born, they had their tubes tied and surgery, and voila, they had the perfect family. The 2 girls, Amanda and Deanna, were attending a local college, studying business administration and living on campus. That evening, Steve worried about Sandra. Herb and Malcolm, who were referred to by their neighbors as a gay couple, but without any derogatory connotation, had brought a case of homemade parsnip wine made from Herb's Irish grandmother's recipe and warned everyone that it foamed like silk, but had a dangerous and stealthy kick like a mule. Everyone heeded their warning, all but a few daredevils who now, nearing midnight, were beginning to pay the price for their foolishness. Sandra was one of them. Steve sighed and grinned as he looked at Sandra. She was chatting with Jess, the wife of her friend and roommate on the block, an accountant a few years older than Steve and Sandra, Bill Janner. Bill watched both women with mild amusement. Jess was drunk, but not as drunk as Sandra. Steve was glad the twins were staying with friends and not at home. He didn't want them to see him putting their mother to bed, and with the obligatory bucket by the bed. He shook his head and grinned. He really didn't mind, and could hardly remember the last time his gorgeous wife had gotten so drunk. Suddenly, Sandra noticed him, and despite being drunk, rose to her feet easily and walked over to her husband quite confidently. She put her arms around him and nuzzled affectionately against his neck. The music playing from the tiny but powerful tape recorder had long since died down, in a concession to the young parents who had children in bed, and only the slight hum of conversations between the remaining dozen or so couples could be heard. Sandra moved away from Steve, took his hand, and said in that strange, loud voice that drunks fondly mistake for an intimate whisper, "Gee, Steve, let's go home and make love. Why don't you take me home and fuck me like Bill does? God, Bill, here's a man who knows how to fuck me good and proper." The light hum of conversation stopped, and everyone, amazed at this turn of events, looked at Sandra. Steve was in shock. Bill seemed to have stopped breathing. Jess was sobbing in her seat. "Oh? And when do you and Bill have sex, Sandra?" Steve asked quietly. "Every Thursday, my love. Every Thursday afternoon. We rent a room at the Friendly Family Motel and have fun like rabbits for about 4 hours. 3 or even 4 times if he can do it again. Then we split up, and I don't know what Bill does, but I cook dinner and then wait for you to get home from the office so I can give you some of my love." Steve continued to ask questions that sounded soft, but he was getting answers that were hard for him to take. "Do you make him use condoms?" "Oh, no, baby. Why would I bother? My tubes are tied, so I like it when he has my bare ass." Steve rubbed his chin nervously. "Why? We've been married for 20 years. Why would you want to have a lover?" "Oh, it's not your fault, Steve. You're just not that good in bed. But don't forget, I love you. I just wish you knew how to have me as well as Bill. Hey, why don't Bill and I invite you to the motel next Thursday? Then he can show you how to do things with me that I really like." She giggled like a teenager. The conversation was interrupted by something that sounded like a gunshot in the sultry night air. It was Jess's hand touching her husband's face. "You bastard!" she screamed at him. She rushed away, followed by Bill, who seemed to be in pain, and not just from the slap. He looked back at Steve, muttered, "I'm sorry," and took off after his wife's rapidly receding back. Herb turned to Malcolm and said in a somewhat wistful stage whisper, "I knew I shouldn't have brought that damn parsnip wine." Steve looked at Sandra for a few long moments and then said, "It's time for me to take you home." The next morning, Sandra woke up feeling like her head was stuffed with electrified balls of absorbent cotton. Staggering, she climbed out of bed to the bathroom and cleaned herself up. She used the electric toothbrush without turning it on, too noisy, and took a couple pills of painkiller. She noticed that Steve was awake on his side of the bed. Damn. If only she could remember what had happened at the party. She was sure something bad had happened, but she couldn't remember exactly what. She walked down the back stairs that led directly to the kitchen. As she entered the room, she saw Steve sitting at the kitchen table. He didn't see her. She watched as he went limp, put his head down on the table and shrugged, and sobbed. At that moment, Sandra remembered what she had done and said at the block party with terrifying clarity. Her harsh, stupid words echoed in her head. She knew she had greatly hurt and broken the love of her life, and worse, in front of most of her neighbors, and even worse, in front of her lover. Why? Why did she drink so much homemade wine? Why? She cautiously approached Steve, stood at the head of the table, and quietly asked, "Steve? Steve, honey? We need to talk." He looked up at her. Jesus, he looked awful. She didn't think he'd slept, probably just sat at his desk all night. "I'm sorry, Steve. I shouldn't have said what I said. It was awful, and I'm really sorry." Steve looked at her, his eyes dimmed with the agonizing pain of his wife's betrayal. "Do you regret what you said? Or what you and Bill did? Do you regret your affair?" "Yes, Steve. I'm sorry I cheated on you. I don't know why I did it. Steve spoke to her in a tone that, because it was filled with quiet desperation and an unfathomable depth of anguish, cut Susan's soul. "Don't start lying, Sandra. It's pointless. You've already told me why you cheated on me, because I'm no good in bed. I'm useless as a lover, so you had to go after the bull to turn me into a cuckold husband." Sandra shook her head. "Oh, no, Steve. You're not a cuckold husband. Not really. I don't like to think of me making a cuckold out of you. And you're not a wuss. I just needed something." Oh. Oh, God. There's no way I can say this without hurting you more, is there? "No, Sandra, probably not. Could you help me by answering a few questions?" "If I can, without causing you more pain, I'll answer them, Steve." "No, Sandra. Don't feel sorry for me. It won't help me, not now. How long have you been sleeping with Bill Janner? Do I need to get tested for STDs? And the hardest question for me, are the twins even mine?" Sandra shrieked slightly. "Oh, Steve, how can you ask me that? Of course the twins are yours. How can you doubt?" Then she looked at the expression on Steve's face and realized the awful truth of what her actions had cost Steve, and at the same time herself. You can't trust me anymore, can you? And it's all because of me." She sobbed. Steve blinked and said, "Now that I'm here, I'm forced to wonder if our entire 20-year marriage was a lie and a sham. Whether your claims of love had any basis, in fact. And if there was, when did you stop loving me enough to stay out of bed with other men? How many have there been besides Bill, Sandra?" Sandra realized that his questions were backfiring, but they all demanded truthful answers. "Steve, the affair with Bill lasted about 6 months, every Thursday. We never made love here, or at Bill's place for that matter. I wouldn't feel entitled to do that to you. I don't think you need an STD test, but if you do, it can't hurt, as it will reassure you. And I have never stopped loving you. Please, please, please know that. And I had no other lovers until I got involved with Bill. And the twins? Please, don't worry. They're definitely yours." Steve shook his head. "I think I need some time to digest all this, to sort it all out. Would you mind staying with your sister for a while?" "If you think I should, Steve. Are you thinking about divorce?" She felt anxious. No, not about that, not about separation, just a few days so I can think about it. I'll call you when I'm ready. She kissed his forehead and squeezed his hand. She was worried. He felt cold and clammy, like he was sick or something. Sandra told the girls that their father was upset about what she had said and that she was going to stay at their Aunt Molly's house for a couple of days. When she arrived at her sister Molly's house, the latter was furious. She was so angry that she was mixing metaphors. "Well, the goose is back on the roof, isn't it? I told you were a stupid bitch for cheating on Steve. And with a fucking accountant? God, sometimes you make me laugh. But Steve's probably not laughing, is he?" "No, Molly, Steve's not laughing. In fact, he's been crying all night sitting at the kitchen table. He's so crushed and hurt, and it's all my stupid fault." "And how did he find out? Did he hire a private investigator?" "No, it's much worse than that. I got drunk at a block party and right in front of everyone, including Bill and his wife Jess, I came clean. I even told Steve that the reason I had a lover was because he was bad in bed. And to make matters worse, I invited him over to watch Bill fuck me so Steve would know how to sleep with me properly." Molly looked at her. Shock reflected on her face. "You? What? Oh, you stupid little prankster. I'm surprised Steve didn't spank you right in front of everyone. Actually, no, I'm not surprised. Steve's a nice guy, too nice to do that. Maybe that's what you were counting on, Sandra. Counting on your husband loving you so much that you could get away with an affair behind his back and get away with it? But what if he decides to divorce you? What then?" They spent the next 3 days discussing the situation, talking about how Sandra could try to make things right, and even about whether things could be fixed at all. It was the 3rd day of Sandra's stay at Molly's house. Bill didn't know that that was where his mistress, or what he assumed was an ex-lover, was staying. He only knew that she had left Steve and that Steve was alone in the house. Bill's wife had made him move into the guest room. This made him feel even more guilty. He expected her to kick him out, but she didn't. Shocked, he realized that her act made him love her even more, which meant his betrayal cut even deeper into him. He sat in the backyard sipping tea and wondered how Steve was handling this. He had always considered Steve a good friend, but he realized that the friendship was over and that it was all Bill's own fault. He suddenly realized that although he had seen Sandra drive away in her car the day before yesterday, he hadn't seen Steve. He began to worry. Had Steve committed suicide? He knew he had promised his wife he would have nothing more to do with Sandra, but this was a different matter, he reasoned. This was about poor, hapless Steve, a buddy who was hurting and suffering alone with some terrible thoughts. On impulse, Bill decided to go into the house and talk to Steve. He knew that Steve might well punch him in the face, but was that so bad? Bill was well aware that he deserved it and more. He rang the bell, then knocked on the door. Although there was no answer, Bill somehow sensed that Steve was inside. Bill noticed that the side gate was open. Squeezing through them, he walked around the side of the house and peered through the long kitchen window. He saw Steve leaning on the table. Bill tapped on the window, but Steve didn't move. In a panic, Bill ran back into the house. He found Jess in the living room reading. "Jess! We have to do something. I was just at Steve and Sandra's house." "Can't get enough of your big-breasted pansy, can you?" spat out Jess. "No, it's nothing like that. I saw Sandra leave a few days ago. I went in to check on Steve. Honey, he doesn't look well. He's sitting at the kitchen table. He's either very sick or dead, and it's all my fucking fault." Jess jumped up and put a hand on his shoulder. "Look, just calm down. I'll dial 911 and we'll get him the help he needs, okay?" 10 minutes later, the police broke down the door of Steve's house and paramedics wheeled Steve out of the house on a gurney and loaded him into an ambulance. A crowd of neighbors had gathered and Bill and Jess stood outside the ambulance. They listened to the ambulance doctors talk. "How are his vitals?" "Shitty, but I've seen worse. Looks like he's dehydrated. He's wet himself. I don't think he's moved for days. Maybe he's having a stroke." "We'll start treatment right away. A saline drip is all we need for now." They closed the doors of the ambulance and, lights and sirens on, rushed to the hospital. Bill was shaking. "Someone should tell his daughters." Jess nodded. "Sure. I'll have Sue write to the twins." Sue was the oldest of Bill and Jess's 3 children and was about the same age as the twins. An hour later, Sandra received a text from Dina. "Mom, I suggest you take your lecherous ass to General Hospital. Daddy is seriously ill in the ICU. You better pray he doesn't die, bitch." A few seconds later, she received a text from Amanda. "I hate you so much." Since Sandra was sobbing and could barely see anything, Molly volunteered to drive her to the hospital. The twins were already there in the hallway. They looked at her with hurt and anger. "How could you do that to Daddy? To us? Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" "It's not like that," gasped Sandra. "You're young. You don't understand." "Oh, Mom, we understand. You decided to cheat on our daddy with one of his best friends. You told us lies. You said what you said upset him. You didn't say exactly what you said or why. And then you callously left him to rot in his own piss and shit for 3 fucking days." "But he told me to leave. He told me not to mess with him. I only did what he asked." "But Mom, you should have cared enough about him to have someone check on him, make sure he was eating and everything. But you didn't, did you? It pisses me off that your own damn cheating buddy cared more about our daddy's health than you did. And how fucked up is that?" Sandra gasped. God, what kind of monster was she? She had repented to Steve, but was it real, genuine remorse? Or did she no longer care about him? She wanted to see her husband, but they told her they couldn't until he was processed and placed in a room. Suddenly, she felt alone. Molly and the twins had gone somewhere. She sat down on an uncomfortable bench. A doctor came out of the room to talk to her. He looked young, with swarthy skin and very, very serious. When he spoke, he had an Indian accent. "Mrs. Bollinger? I'm Dr. Singh. It seems your husband has had some sort of breakdown. He is very severely dehydrated. We are putting him on an IV. He hasn't moved in days. We're worried he may have had a stroke. Has he had a stroke before?" She stood up and turned to face the doctor. "No, Dr. Singh. As far as I know, he hasn't had a stroke. But you see, recently my husband found out that I was having an affair. He took it very badly. I think he had a breakdown because of it. It's all my fault." She started sobbing again. It seemed to Susan that almost all the time she was faced with another reminder of how horribly she had messed up. Dr. Singh nodded. He said, "If you'd like, you can see him in about 20 minutes. He'll be in room D, corridor 4, floor 3. By the time she got there, it was too late. Steve had gone into cardiac arrest. They tried to save him, but it turned out that he had a hidden and unknown heart condition that had worsened dramatically due to lack of fluids during the 3 days he had been sitting alone. The doctor's intervention was too late to save him. The funeral was hellish. The twins wouldn't speak to her, and Steve's elderly mother slapped Sandra in the face at the graveside. She went back to their house. The door the cops had broken down had been rebuilt, but it wasn't a house anymore. It wasn't even a home. She had killed her husband as easily as if she had plunged a knife into his heart. Her own daughters wanted nothing to do with her. Bill didn't want to talk to her. Jess, who had been a good friend, hated her. Sandra was left alone. Unable to go to the kitchen, she went to the den to find a bottle of rum and a glass. She knew where the sleeping pills were. Maybe she could go get them and wash them down with the rest of the rum, and then maybe she could try to find Steve and apologize to him for hurting him so badly.